tenim la primera sessió, que és l'emergència climàtica a judici. Poden tenir èxit els tribunals davant el fracàs de la política? A la majoria de països la crisi climàtica no ha aconseguit atreure l'atenció política, però passa que els tribunals han estat relativament receptius a les reclamacions sobre el canvi climàtic. En aquesta conferència, la professora Jackie Dugard ens presentarà quin és el context del litigi a les Nacions Unides i analitzarà els èxits obtinguts i també els reptes que cal afrontar sobre l'emergència climàtica. Benvinguda, Jackie. Jackie és doctora en Ciències Polítiques i Socials per la Universitat de Cambridge. És professora titular de Drets Humans en l'Institut per a l'Estudi dels Drets Humans i el Departament de Ciències Polítiques de la Universitat de Columbia, a Nova York. També és professora a la Facultat de Dret en la Universitat de Witwatersrand i ara és professora visitant. I és fundadora i primera directora executiva de l'organització no governamental Socioeconomic Rights, Institute of South Africa. També és primera fundadora de l'Oficina d'Igualtat de Gènere a les Nacions Unides. No, de gènere de Witwatersrand, perdoneu. I és la líder del grup de treball sobre terres i habitatges d'un projecte finançat per les Nacions Unides. A banda d'això, ha publicat nombroses publicacions sobre drets socioeconòmics, el dret a la terra i a la propietat, sobre el paper de la llei i els tribunals en el canvi social i també sobre protestes i moviments socials i temes de violència de gènere. La sessió d'avui constarà, és una conferència, la professora Jackie Dugard parlarà durant uns 30 minuts i després interpel·larà el públic i també li podreu fer preguntes. Moltíssimes gràcies i benvinguda, Jackie.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. So I must first apologize that unfortunately I do not speak Spanish, which is, I hope you don't count too much against me. It is my great hope that one day I manage to speak Spanish. But in the meantime, I hope you will understand that I speak in English. I would like to first of all thank La Caixa Foundation for this invitation and to Monica Badia and the team for inviting me here. I'm really excited to talk to you today. I hope that we can have a discussion afterwards. I would like to be as interactive as possible. I know it's not so easy across the interpretation, but I hope we can try. So I want to talk today about a very serious issue, but I want to speak about it with hope and with love. I feel like it is so important that we take action about climate change. I think it is a very serious issue that requires immediate action. I don't want anybody to feel overwhelmed, though, by the seriousness of it. I think there is action that we can take, and I want to talk today about the fact that courts have begun to take this action. And I want to take inspiration also. I teach a course on climate justice at Columbia, and I take inspiration from my students, young people who are all completely committed to fight climate change in different ways, in different places. But I really take inspiration from the fact that we can do something. We need to do something, but we can do something. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and perhaps we can also have a discussion. So thank you very much again, and let's talk about just some of the basics. I'm sure most of you already know that we've known globally since the 1970s that our economic activities, especially fossil fuel energy and mining and resource extraction, have caused levels of greenhouse gas emissions with the potential to dangerously alter the climate and threaten all life on Earth. We all know and we've seen evidence of climate change in wildly changing weather, in the expectations changing from how the weather will look at particular seasons, in rising sea levels, in extreme weather conditions, floods, droughts, tornadoes, etc. So I think most of us would already have seen that climate change exists. And of course, 99% of scientists in the world would confirm that climate change is real. Indeed, some people call the geological epoch that we're in the Anthropocene, because it describes the fact that we are in a human-made climate change era. But I will touch on this, and maybe we can return during questions to the fact that some people feel that the term Anthropocene is actually not a good term, because this man-made or person-made change to the climate has only really been made by certain people. Most of the world hasn't really contributed towards the current problem. Most people in the world, particularly from the global south, from indigenous communities, from poor communities, have not benefited from our economic development, and they haven't contributed towards the current crisis. So some people think Anthropocene is not the right term. What have we done so far? So in my talk, I want to talk about a generalized failure of politics and how the courts and the law has stepped in to take the lead on what we should be doing. But it needs to be said that we have had since 1994 at the UN level a framework for dealing with climate change. So this is known as the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, and this has bound 198 parties since 1994 in terms of the goal of trying to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, it is the greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide notably, but others as well, that is driving climate change. And then many of you will, of course, know about the Paris Agreement, which falls within the UNFCCC framework. This is from 2015. It's a legally binding instrument at the UN level, which commits the states parties, and importantly, this includes the US. Why do I mention that? Because the US is the world's historical largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So without the US, the Kyoto Protocol, the previous protocol did not include the US, and without the US, one can, I think it's fair to say, probably not really tackle climate change, since it is the largest historic emitter of greenhouse gases. But the Paris Agreement, which the US signed, then former President Trump removed the US from it, but now it's back. The US is back in it under President Biden, and hopefully it stays that way. Have to hold our fingers about that. But this binds state parties to try to keep the level of temperature rise, global temperature rise, to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Why these temperatures? Well, we understand, scientists tell us that we simply do not know how humans and other life on Earth will survive above a 2% rise. So this is why we have been trying to keep the temperature rise to below that level. And the UNFCCC framework does this through 5-year climate action plans, which are called nationally determined contributions. So this is all extremely important. But although it is legally binding, there isn't a direct enforcement mechanism for the UNFCCC or for the Paris Agreement. So this is where I would say comes, well, first let's talk about the current reality before I come to the human rights connection. So unfortunately, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but in February 2024, we passed a very important and very upsetting and distressing threshold when for the first time over a 12-month period, global temperature rises were above 1.5 degrees Celsius. In other words, we have shot past the lower threshold that the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement try to keep us to. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that we can, with concerted effort, scientists believe we can still keep to below 2%, but we have to take that action. We have to take it now. We have to take it concertedly and everywhere, everybody doing our bit, and we can maybe talk a little bit about that when I finish. What I want to bring into the mix is that I believe that unfortunately in many countries, and I'm not speaking about Spain, it may be different, perhaps we can talk about that a little bit, but in many countries you're seeing a surging of right-wing populism with people, I think, concerned about climate action, concerned about their security around climate change, concerned about what will a green economy mean for them. Will they lose their jobs? Will they lose their jobs? For example, in the US, there are real concerns around car manufacturing, that kind of thing, and with China making electronic vehicles, will people in the US, will workers lose their jobs? So I think that the political side of things has, in my view, and I want to put out there as an argument, hasn't sufficiently tackled the question of people's security. We haven't sufficiently worked on making the connection that, in fact, moving to a green economy with less greenhouse gas emissions will be better for everybody. If we can put the funding into the green economy, into the jobs, into technically gearing workers, into making people feel more secure. But I think that in many countries that hasn't happened, and so you see politics kind of going in the opposite direction. And so this is where I want to say that we are at this moment where we have a conundrum. So we need to, what is clear is that we need to take concerted action now. Otherwise, we may be okay. Everybody in this room, and I'm looking around to see if there are some very young people here, even younger than myself, and I'm super young. Not really. But I think most of us, if we don't take concerted action, we are dooming future generations. Maybe not ourselves, maybe we will be okay. But future generations, our children and their children, we are dooming them to a very, very bleak history. And I'm going to pick up this question about future generations in the litigation and the court cases. So what I'm saying is that if we don't act now, we are really doing a disservice and committing human rights violations against future generations, people in the global south, people who haven't caused the harm and haven't benefited from it. So what is the human rights link that I want to talk about? I worked for most of my career on socioeconomic rights, and in many areas of the world, socioeconomic rights are considered non-justiciable. I will say, by the way, that Spain is at the forefront. Spain is one of the first countries that ratified the UN Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So Spain is not one of those countries. Spain has recognized economic, social, and cultural rights. And as you may well know, well, actually, I'm not sure if you do know this, the vast majority of cases that have come before the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights relate to Spanish housing. So it is people being evicted from Spanish housing. So Spain has actually got a really interesting role in the story about socioeconomic rights. But if you'd asked me about whether I thought the courts would more easily deal with socioeconomic rights or climate change, if you asked me 10 years ago, I would have said definitely socioeconomic rights. Climate change is too difficult for the courts. And yet the opposite is the truth. The courts have struggled much more with socioeconomic rights, and they have begun to take the lead on climate action. And why do I say that it might be difficult for judges to deal with climate change? Well, it is inherently transboundary. What do I mean by that? Once a country emits, so let's take the US. The US in the 1980s, all of the emissions from its economic growth during the 1980s, 90s, and continually, it's out there in the atmosphere pretty much forever and everywhere. In other words, it is there is no way that we can just say, well, the US's emissions just stick with US boundaries. No, they don't. They go around the world, and we can say, I think, it's fair to say that the US is responsible for most or much of the current climate change and adverse climatic conditions. So because of that, it's very difficult for judges to deal with this, because courts tend to focus on the law, and laws are always national. And then also is the fact that the international human rights law machinery, treaties don't mention climate change at all. I was just asked now by a journalist from La Vanguardia whether we need a new treaty. Maybe we need a new UN treaty on climate change. There's a good question around that. Maybe we can discuss it later. But treaties take a long, long time, and sometimes you wouldn't get it passed. So in the meantime, I'm going to show you how courts around the world, including at the UN level, have used what we have in order to take climate action. And then there is this question of attribution. So, countries can say, well, look, all countries have contributed towards climate change. How is a court going to deal with this question of how much harm has your country, has Spain caused? So that's another difficulty for judges. And then there is the question of, although we all understand if we don't act now, there will be serious threats to all life on Earth. If I stand before a court and I say, I am alleging that my right to life, because you'll see in the cases the right to life is one of the rights which has been used a lot in climate change litigation. So if I come before a court and I say, my right to life is being threatened, a judge is going to say, well, you look fine. You look okay. You don't have a gun to your head. I don't see you in jail being tortured by the police. Doesn't look like you're about to die. So this is one of the questions that makes it difficult for courts. And then there's the question of separation of powers. I'm not sure how many lawyers are here, and I won't get into the details too much here, but in courts like to restrict themselves to the law and narrowly, and they like to try to keep policy for the legislature, for politics, for elected officials, because courts are not elected. So programs and policy they try to keep out of the courtroom. And this climate change is inherently structural, programmatic. It involves everything. So this is another difficulty for courts. Yet, the cases just keep on coming, and there has been an explosion of cases over the last decade. And according to the Grantham Research Institute, more than 50% of the cases have been successful and have had an impact on the climate or the environment. That is an extremely high success rate for cases, especially for such a difficult situation and for the courts. So what are the issues that courts have taken up in their rulings? The one question is about climate refugees, and we can maybe talk again a little bit about that in our questions. The terminology climate refugees is quite controversial. Some people say we shouldn't refer to people who have to move because of the climate as refugees, because there is a stigma attached, and also because the current refugee law, the Refugee Convention, doesn't acknowledge people moving for either socioeconomic reasons or climate reasons. The only reason in the Refugee Convention is a well-founded fear of persecution, political persecution. So we have a problem with a lag in the law on refugees. Yet, of course, that doesn't mean that climate refugees aren't coming and won't come. So I think this is a reality that the courts are beginning to move to recognize, even if politics is not recognizing it. Then we have the question of national targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this relates to the Paris Agreement and what each country has said that it will reduce its carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by. The courts have begun to tackle that question as well. There's the question of extraterritorial obligations. This relates, and it's very legal, and I'll try not to get too much in depth there, but this relates to the problem I was referring to, that climate change is global. The atmosphere is global. Therefore, how do we relate to this question of something that is extraterritorial? It doesn't relate only to the national boundaries. There's attribution in the context of the collective problem, where one state says, well, everyone has caused climate change, so why should our people have to, make the change? And then this issue of protection of future generations, and I really want to stress this again. I'll keep coming back to it because I think anybody who is a parent, anybody who's a grandparent, this is something we should really be caring about. The question of intergenerational burden sharing. What do I mean there? I mean that if we carry on in the way that we are dooming future generations, and we are not fairly sharing the burden between us and them. We are taking all the benefit and putting all the burden onto them, because life will be pretty impossible if we don't do anything now. And then there's the question of halting additional fossil fuel or mining operations. So these are some of the issues taken up by the courts. So I'll run through some of the cases quickly. I know that the details sometimes, if you're not interested in law like I am, the details can be a little bit boring. But right now is the moment when I told you previously that we don't have a climate change human rights treaty at the international level, but what we do have is a UN General Assembly resolution from 2023, which was brought by Vanuatu. Vanuatu is one of the Pacific Island states, and you may well know that the Pacific Island states are at threat. I would say more than at threat. They are going to go under the sea. I think hardly anyone believes that they can stop it now. So already some of those Pacific Island states, including Tuvalu, are trying to take action. And what do I mean by that? First of all, they're trying to figure out where will their people go. They're trying to make political agreements about where the people will go. And secondly, Tuvalu has started a process of digitizing its entire topography, geography, culture, so that in the future, when Tuvalu doesn't exist anymore because it is under the sea, then people from Tuvalu can go and visit their country virtually, online, through this digitized record. So that is already happening. There are countries that are disappearing because of climate change. So Vanuatu, one of those Pacific islands that is facing, I'm not even sure what word we can use for the entire disappearance of your country, countryside, I suppose. Vanuatu brought a resolution in the UN General Assembly to ask the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the obligations of states in the context of climate change. So that advisory opinion will come down this year. That's happening this year. We will have a clear sense from the International Court of Justice about what the obligations of every member state of the UN is regarding climate change. At the same time, by the way, just to say that the Inter-American Court is also hearing an advisory opinion application, and indeed they met last week in Barbados to have the hearings around an advisory opinion in the Inter-American system. Then there are also already some key cases at the UN treaty body level. So the UN Human Rights Committee, which oversees the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in a decision called Tetiota versus New Zealand, established the principle that countries may not deport people who face climate-induced conditions that violate their human rights, and that the Refugee Convention would have to be expanded to include climate refugees. And then the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which oversees the convention, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, in 2021, a very important decision called Sachi versus Argentina. It expanded the legal definition of extraterritorial obligations to situations in which state actions or emissions cause foreseeable cross-border harm. So what I mean here is that in effect, exactly the story I was telling you about, that the US would be then therefore held responsible for harm, foreseeable harm it created anywhere in the world according to this standard. I will just say that this standard has not yet been accepted in Europe. I will come to the European situation now. It has been accepted by the Inter-American Court and by the UN Committee, but the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child is not directly enforceable unless the countries have domesticated the law. So at the regional level, as I mentioned, there is an advisory opinion being sought from the Inter-American Court. And then, most importantly for you in Europe, is the really exciting case from the 9th of April from the European Court of Human Rights, which of course binds the European Council members. It is directly binding on all European Council member states. And this case of Klimasignorinen versus Switzerland established that Switzerland's targets under the Paris Agreement and nationally, so the targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are made in terms of the Paris Agreement are not ambitious enough to safeguard the human rights of future generations. Within the European Convention, they looked at Article 8 on the right to family. So I think this is really interesting because this links to the future generations question. They didn't go, the court did not go for the right to life as they have in other jurisdictions, but they went to the right to family life, dealing with future generations. And it ruled that Switzerland needs to further reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to ensure what the court said is appropriate intergenerational burden sharing. So this goes to the issue I've been talking about, that we here can't sit back and do nothing and doom the future generations. We have to do something. And the European Court, which is generally a conservative court, it's a cautious court, it's not an activist court, and yet even it decided it had to do something. So I think this is a really important judgment. And it follows from, I will just talk about two very important European domestic cases. The one is from Germany, the German Federal Constitutional Court in Neubauer versus Germany from 2021. So in a similar way to the European Court in the Swiss case, ruled that Germany's Climate Protection Act, which was enacted according to the Paris Agreement commitments, that its target, Germany's target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 55% was insufficient to limit global temperature rise to below 2 degrees, in line with the Paris Agreement. So it struck down parts of the law and ordered the government to devise a new plan for 65% reduction. Just to flag for those who are interested, that is now being litigated at the European Court level because the activists involved feel that Germany's plan is still not ambitious enough, it's not sufficient enough. But very importantly, in the Neubauer case, the court, the German Federal Constitutional Court, found that the plan unfairly favored the current generation over future generations, and that the burden needed to be more fairly distributed. What the court said is, well, this is the English translation, the court obviously said it in German, one generation must not be allowed to consume large portions of the CO2 carbon dioxide budget while bearing a relatively minor share of the reduction effort, if this would involve leaving subsequent generations with a drastic reduction burden and expose their lives to serious losses of freedom. So I think that's a really important principle established by the German Federal Constitutional Court. And importantly also, the court found that the collective nature of the crisis, in other words, the fact that all countries, especially richer countries, have contributed to climate change, did not negate the obligation for each state to take climate action responsibly. And then a very similar case is the Agenda case of 2018 from the Netherlands. So it ruled that in terms of Dutch law, the duty of care in Dutch law, and European law, Article 2 and Article 8 of the European Convention, Article 2 being the right to life, Article 8 being the right to family life, The Dutch government's plan, again, their plan under the Paris Agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 17% was insufficient to meet the Netherlands' fair contribution towards the UN goal of limiting global temperature rises to below 2 degrees. And again, the court found that the collective nature of the problem did not absolve the Dutch government from action, and it ordered the government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020. So that's the agenda case. And then South Africa, my own country, in 2020, the court found that the government's issuing of a license for a new coal-fired power station was in violation of our Environmental Act and also the Paris Agreement commitments, and it set aside that decision so to issue a new license for a new extra coal-fired station. So just before I end, I wanted to talk to you about the front line of the battle of climate action. And I think really the front line around the world is being waged and fought by indigenous communities. This is a picture from South Africa, from what we call the Wild Coast in South Africa, where a community called Golobeni has been fighting for 10 years to stop titanium mining. Apparently the sand dunes around Golobeni have the world's 10th largest titanium reserve. So they've been fighting an Australian mining company for 10 years to block titanium mining. What do the people want to do instead of mining? First of all, the people feel that titanium mining will destroy their way of life, their culture, and also the environment and contribute towards climate change. Instead, they would like to do ecotourism. They would like to have a pastoral way of life. They would like to pursue a more caring, sustainable way of life than mining, which destroys, in their words, destroys relationships. They say when a mine comes, it destroys families, it destroys relationships, and it destroys the environment. So in this case, called Baleni in South Africa, the North Gauteng High Court in 2018 ruled in favor of the community to stop mining in this pristine area in recognition of the people's cultural rights and the right to a safe and healthy environment. So I think with that, I'm going to stop. I would put out there for reflection and maybe for discussion the question of whether it is appropriate to rely on courts for climate action. Is it necessary? What are the consequences if we do this? What are the consequences for politics, for climate change? And another question I would put out there is it useful for us to talk about a climate crisis or a climate emergency? Or does that end up with people being immobilized by fear? Should we be talking about a crisis or not? So with that, I would love to take questions and have a bit of a discussion. Thank you. Okay, so I see a question at the back. Yes, sir, in the middle. Oh.
Hola, buenas tardes. Gracias, Jackie, por tu ponencia y toda la información. Muy útil y muy interesante. Perdón. Mi pregunta es si realmente...
Sorry, one moment. I'm not hearing the Spanish. I'm not hearing the English translation. Sorry, one moment.
You have to switch channel.
Yeah, I think it looks like it's on. Oh, 2, I was told 1. Okay. How do I make, 1, yeah. Perfect, okay. Thank you.
¿Repito lo de antes o...? ¿Sí?
Sí.
Vale. Buenas tardes, muchas gracias, Jackie, por toda tu información y la ponencia tan interesante. Quería hacerte una pregunta porque creo que todo exige una respuesta global, ¿no? Y creo que sería el camino a nivel judicial, pero ¿realmente hay alguna organización a nivel mundial, como el máximo top sería la ONU, ¿no?, que pueda obligar a los países a tomar ciertas decisiones o obligar a nivel planetario a crear grandes santuarios de biodiversidad, de protección, etcétera? ¿O simplemente es que, al igual que en Kioto, París, Dubái, bla, 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 todo el mundo se tiene que poner de acuerdo para hacer no sé qué, que no se van a poner de acuerdo? O sea, ¿cabría la posibilidad de una especie de cascos azules verdes?
Okay, should I answer? Okay, all right. Thank you for that really great question. I think it is a very important question to ask. When I talk to my students, I always say to them, unfortunately, we don't have an intergalactic government. We still rely on nation states. My own personal view is we have to move away from that because our problems are global, as you say. I think nation states we saw in COVID, I think we're seeing in climate change, are not really the best unit of governance for global crises. So my own personal view is that in the future we probably will move away from nation states, but right now I think that my argument is that we should all do what we can in our spaces. So I think at the personal level, at the individual level, there are actions one can take in one's own household, questions about recycling, questions about consumption of goods, consumption of agribusiness farmed meat and food. We can take those kind of decisions. We can take decisions politically. We can mobilize politically, whether it's at the local level, at the state level. And as I've talked about today, we see that courts are also taking action. But I think your question is really getting to the crux of it, which is that ultimately this is a collective action political problem. We need to try to influence politics in order to take action, whether that means making our governments more responsive and also taking more action at the UN level. We do have UN mechanisms. The question is whether we can make them work. So, we see currently, unfortunately, the failure of the UN Security Council, and we see the failure of the UN to be able to assist to resolve the current crisis in Gaza. Whenever I teach, I also teach international human rights law. My students say, well, look, why do we need to learn about this? Because look at the failure. But I think you can also look at the little places where you have successes, and I've tried to bring some of those today. So I agree with you that, if we're looking harshly, the current structures are not working. But I think my own view is that struggle is constant, and we have the power, people have the power to push forward for change. I hope that answers the question. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por su intervención. Llevo muchos años, soy activista y he llegado a la conclusión de que el problema es de una magnitud que se precisan cambios sociales y económicos que sinceramente los veo todavía lejos y tenemos una emergencia, ¿no? Mi sugerencia y pregunta es, ¿por qué no intentamos los intelectuales, los artistas, hacer un film con una visión realística, pero utópica, del futuro? Solo se hacen films distópicos, con un futuro negativo, un futuro desastroso. Pienso que la ciudadanía necesita estímulos basados en realidad, aunque una parte sea utópica, porque no lo sabemos. Pero yo creo que un gran film de esta materia sería un buen revulsivo a nivel mundial para mover masas, porque no veo otra manera. Gracias. No sé qué opina.
That is such a lovely idea. I think that is super interesting because I agree with you that the films are all dystopian and very alarming. I agree that we need news stories. I agree that we need positive stories. I think we need to understand that there are alternatives, that we could lead a different way of life that is more caring, more sustainable, where, the care economy, for example, where people who care for each other are valued, where teachers are properly valued, where people who care for the elderly, for children, are properly valued, and where it is less harmful on the environment and on other people, less exploitative of other people. I think these are all possible ways of life, which many people do pursue in the world. Just in the global north, we have lost touch, I think, many of us, with that kind of society and economy. And I think your idea about making films about this is a wonderful one. So, Monica, does La Caixa involve itself at all in making films? I think this is a great idea of a project. I love it. Anyone else?
Sí. Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, creo que quiero hacer una pregunta presentando un caso que seguro la profesora conoce, que es el caso de Sudáfrica y la famosa comité presidencial que creó el presidente Ramaphosa para hacer una transición energética justa en Sudáfrica. Lo quiero poner como ejemplo porque es cuando se atrae a la sociedad civil, a los trabajadores, a los activistas, a las ONGs, a un comité donde se supone que van a tener voz, igual que las empresas, las multinacionales, y cuando ya están dentro y llegan los famosos partenariados que salen de esta idea de que los países del norte global tienen que ayudar al sur global a hacer sus transiciones, resulta que cuando empiezan a hablar del dinero y dónde se va a implementar ese dinero, pues echan a la sociedad civil. ¿Usted cree que este tipo de iniciativas a veces ayudan o a veces son negativas? Porque se invita a la sociedad civil y cuando llega el momento de hablar del dinero se las expulsa, ¿no? Como persona de Sudáfrica que debe conocer el tema, ¿usted cree que esto sigue siendo un buen modelo o sigue siendo una buena iniciativa a replicar en otras partes del mundo? Gracias. Lo digo porque he trabajado con COSATU y se enfadaron mucho, se salieron del comité porque en el momento de hablar de dinero y dónde iría ese dinero se les cerraron las puertas, ¿no? Por eso hago la pregunta. Gracias.
Thank you. I think that there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. I think that we all have to try what we can. I think that these types of projects are extremely important. I think that presidential commissions' attempts to pursue a just transition are extremely important in each country, across the world. It's not always going to succeed, but I think that politics is a terrain of continual struggle, and I agree with you that exclusion is a problem wherever it exists and that participation is key. Personally, I feel like one of the problems that creates exclusion is inequality. South Africa is the most unequal society on earth, and you see all sorts of problems in the politics. And I would commend everybody who hasn't seen. I would say if the most important book that I have ever read is a book by two British epidemiologists called Kate Pickett. So the authors are Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. It's called The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone. And this book looks at the fact that from an epidemiological scientific perspective, that the more unequal your society, the more problems you have in terms of violence, teenage pregnancy, low life expectancy, high infant mortality, alcoholism, etc., etc., etc. So part of the problem with inequality is that there is low trust in the society. People don't feel that they're together trying to do the same thing. Rich people get a good deal. the other people do not. Politics is captured. So I think in South Africa you see a lot of that happening, unfortunately. And certainly I believe that that's why, to take us back to the question of socioeconomic rights, I think it's key that, for example, workers, we make a reality in which workers are made to feel secure, more secure by a climate transition than less secure. Otherwise, I think it's not going to succeed. So I agree with you 100% that we have to work on inclusion. We have to work on participation. I think that many countries are showing us the way to go. There are some, bumps in the road, but I think, we can learn from those lessons around the importance of not excluding people due to money, lack of money, etc. I'm not sure if that 100% answers your question, but I would say that we need to keep trying, even if there have been some, missteps on the road. Anyone else? Gentleman over there.
Sí, hola. Sí, hola, bona tarda. Gràcies per les informacions que ens feies arribar, per les respostes que dones a les preguntes que fa la resta d'assistents. I m'apunto una altra pregunta, però abans faig una reflexió. La frase crisi climàtica o emergència climàtica d'alguna manera a mi em paralitza, i crec que no només a mi, sinó a altres persones. És a dir, té una denominació, una connotació de que no només científics, de que no només d'alguna manera polítics que estiguin institucionalment situats poden revertir aquesta situació. Soc de la confiança que després de la invasió de Rússia sobre Ucraïna el 24 de febrer de 2022, l'alarma que es va generar en relació als combustibles fòssils que hauria d'exportar-se des de Rússia en direcció a Alemanya va esparverar realment la situació, va encarir el preu del petroli, va encarir el preu de l'electricitat, va encarir el preu del gas natural. Semblava que el cel se'ns cauria al sobre, com passa amb Astèrix i Obèlix. Semblava que el cel se'ns cauria al sobre. D'alguna manera, aquesta situació desesperada va generar una resposta dintre de la Comunitat Europea d'alliberar aquesta tensió i varen tenir l'exemple que el dia 8 de març, per exemple, del 2022, el megawati hora em sembla que valia 500 euros, és una barbaritat. El megawati hora el dia 28 d'abril d'aquest any va passar a 0 euros. No ha hagut cap miracle, no ha hagut cap efecte provocat per la casualitat, sinó que ha hagut un moviment institucional que quan la cosa es posa realment alarmant, crítica, d'alguna manera es treballa de forma raonada pensant en el llarg termini. Penso que la humanitat té una capacitat de determinació ràpida quan pensa a curt termini, però torpe quan pensa a llarg termini. Quan el llarg termini se'ns posa realment davant dels nassos, crec que la capacitat de reacció que hi ha per part del consumidor i per part dels polítics que es representen institucionalment arriba a un moment d'esperança de que efectivament no podrem caure en un caos definitiu, almenys ara per ara, excepte aquest atoló, aquesta illa de Turbuk, que suposo que malauradament no tenen remei. Gràcies.
Thanks. Thank you. That question, raises something that we haven't talked about yet. But this is something the courts are dealing with, the question of burden sharing. So, some of the cases before the European Court currently involve Norway, and Norway arguing that it needs to have more oil exploration. So it's kind of asking for, yes, we said we know that we committed to reducing this, no more new oil licenses in terms of the Paris Agreement, nationally determined contributions, but Russia invaded Ukraine. We have an energy crisis in Europe, therefore we need to have more oil. And those cases are currently before the European Court. I don't know what the court will say, because this would definitely, in Norway's case, take it over what its contributions are. And so it will be interesting to see what the European Court says. I don't want to suggest that there's an easy answer here. I just want to suggest that what the court in the Swiss case, what the European Court has said in the Swiss case, And what the German court has said in the Neubauer case and the Dutch court has said in the Ogenda case is that there's no win-win-win-win situation here. If we carry on without making sacrifices, then somebody will pay. This is the thing with the planet. It is a circular, it is finite. As things stand, we would need 7 planets to keep up with our levels of consumption and carbon emissions. So something has got to give. Either this generation carries on as we are, and we drill more oil, we continue to mine, we create more consumption, etc., and then we understand that we are dooming our children to an absolutely awful future. That is the choice. That's the way I see it. Now, I personally don't have children, so I don't have a direct stake here, but I am always amazed that people with children aren't more concerned about this. What will happen in their children's lifetime? And so I think that it is true that something has got to give. Someone has got to give up something. Some people have to give up something. If we don't, if we who live in the global north, if richer countries, if more wealthy people don't start thinking about this and making a change, then I think the reality is that our children will have a very bleak history or future, and it will be a history, I suppose, as well. So I think your question touches on that difficult subject about, do we have to give things up? How do we do that? I don't want to suggest it's easy. Currently already in Europe, the energy bills are so high that people can't afford them. On the other hand, you have billionaires with so much money that they couldn't possibly spend it in their lifetime. So we have, I think, the ability to equalize more, to distribute more. And the obvious mechanism is taxation. So I think we may have to be thinking about this more and more. And this also goes back to the political question, how we influence and mobilize the politics. I hope that's somewhat of an answer.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, so even if we see that the courts decide in favor in 50% of the cases to the environment, are the decisions really respected? Because at the end, this is a national police who need to take action or to find the companies. Does that really happen?
Yeah, a good, really great question, and it's one my students always ask me. But I feel that, first of all, I think in the European system, there is a high degree of enforcement of courts' decisions and of the European Court. The European Court decisions are binding on the European Council members. So I think that in Europe, we can probably answer the most positively about that. Elsewhere, it is a good question. The inter-American system, lots of the decisions are never enforced. In the UN system, you have countries that just ignore what the treaty bodies say, even though it should be binding. And even in some national systems, for example, in India, quite infamously, many of the decisions of the courts are just ignored. I will say that even if you live in a country where court decisions are ignored, and Spain is not one of those countries. I think Spain is a country where the court decisions are enforced. But if you live in a country where court decisions are ignored, I still think it's important because it changes the narrative. I think it is part of, and to go back to that gentleman's question about the stories that we have, I think it's extremely important. Courts have a power to them, a drama. It's like a theater. There's performance. And I think that it elevates the discussion in a way that I have found quite transcendental in my own work, even if you lose in court, even if the court decision is not upheld, it has an extreme power, I think, what lawyers say, what judges say. So I feel it's important, even if the decisions are not upheld. But within the European system, it's a much more positive story about enforcement of court decisions. I saw, I think this gentleman, and then somebody else in the middle, I think, yes, that lady there. I don't know where the mic is.
Yes, I do have it, sorry. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the conference and also for giving me some hope, because I'm an international relations student and therefore we've studied a lot about international law, international enforcement mechanisms, the UN system, and hence you giving some positive cases, it just puts away all the frustration that gives me to study that and seeing that it's not being applied.
Sorry, where are you? I can't see you. Can you put up your hand? Oh, there you are. Okay, great. I just want to look at you while you're talking. No, thank you. Thank you, yes.
And well, I wanted to ask you if you really think that at the end of the day, it all comes back to humanity, like to being empathetic with each other, to being able to understand that maybe we have climate refugees now, even if we don't want to see it, and that also we're in Spain and we could be the next climate refugees in the next 50 years. And I don't know, what are your thoughts about that, and how do you think we could be more aware about the issue that is, at least in social terms, not only in scientific ones?
Great. Well, thank you. You look like you're one of the younger people who I take a lot of inspiration from. I take tremendous inspiration from the younger generation. I feel like younger people really see this. They really see the need to act. And so I'm glad that I could give you a little bit of positive news about the court cases. But yeah, I honestly believe, look, I come from a country that moved from an apartheid system into a post-apartheid system. People thought it couldn't happen. It happened in my lifetime. So I am the eternal optimist about the ability of people to change. If you want to, collectively, and you mobilize, I have great faith that human beings can do this. I also have great faith that a system that benefits 1% or 10% of the world's population is unsustainable, that we can find better systems. I have a lot of faith in that. And I think part of what we need to be doing is telling different stories and telling hopeful stories about alternative systems. I can't remember who is the person who has said somehow we seem to be able to imagine the end of the world before we can imagine the end of capitalism. But actually, I think that we can think about ways, even for capitalism, to be more sustainable, to be more caring, to be less exploitative of people and the environment. I think this is all within human power if we collectively mobilize around it. I truly believe anything is possible.
Hola. Hola, buenas tardes. A ver, tengo muchas notas, voy a intentar a ver si puedo decirlo de alguna manera coherente. Antes has comentado el poder, ¿no?, de las pequeñas acciones y que la importancia de empoderar a la gente y de poder de esas pequeñas acciones, ya sea a través del voto, para que llegue al gobierno, ya sea a través de los hábitos de consumo, para que llegue a las empresas, ya sea por ética, por humanidad, ética personal, de cara, igual que no tiras un papel al suelo, pues ¿por qué no te vas a preocupar, ¿no?, de tus pequeñas acciones, de esos cambios que puedes hacer a nivel de tu propia casa, de tus propios hábitos, ¿no? Esa ética, esa humanidad, ese sentido común, ese ser consecuente, ¿no? Y ya no pensando en el futuro, es que con pensar en el presente es suficiente. Yo vivo a 100 metros del mar, nos hemos quedado sin playa en los 2 últimos años. O sea, no tengo que pensar en el futuro, no tengo que pensar en mi hija, pienso en mí. Igual que no me gusta ir a una playa y encontrarla llena de microplásticos o de macroplásticos. O sea, no hay que pensar en el futuro, ya con pensar en el presente y en una vida ética, ¿no? No hace falta pensar a nivel global, no, igual que no haces otras cosas a nivel de usuario, a nivel de ciudadano, pues ¿qué lo vas a hacer? Luego también una cosa que quería comentar un poquito para dar esperanza es que no nos olvidemos que en los 80, en los 90 solo se hablaba de reducir las emisiones, el uso de los aerosoles por el tema de la capa de ozono, de los agujeros de la capa de ozono. Eso se consiguió revertir y cambiamos nuestros hábitos y no costó nada. Pues hay esperanza, claro que se puede hacer. Eso es todo.
Yeah, I think the ozone layer issue is a really important one to raise. That was a global issue that was really in quite a short period of time resolved extraordinarily, and I think that should give us hope. And I totally agree with you that starting local is and starting now and moving in our environment. And I believe very strongly that, as you say, the little actions you do in your environment, but also kindness and consideration towards people around you in your daily life is part of making a change. It's part of taking positive action to have a less exploitative, less extractive world. So yes, and thank you for raising the ozone issue, because it is a startling example of a success story globally, which I think we can take inspiration from. I see that we're at time, but I don't know, should we have one more question? Yes. Yeah.
Sí. Bueno, sí, buenas tardes. Quería comentar que está resultando muy interesante, ¿no?, la conferencia y el debate, ¿no? Yo quería hacer una pregunta un poco más concreta y referida al derecho, ¿no? Bueno, aquí ha salido un poco la situación de emergencia climática. Ya lo vemos que los datos del panel de expertos del cambio climático nos dan unos datos bastante concretos y bastante negativos, ¿no? Y las proyecciones, pues tampoco son buenas, ¿no? En general, genera, digamos, una desconfianza, digamos, en el futuro, ¿no? Sobre todo nos rompe un poco la idea del progreso ad infinitum que teníamos, en el que creíamos que la tecnología siempre iba a mejorar, ¿no?, nuestras vidas, ¿no? Y vemos que es al contrario, ¿no? Entonces, esto aparte de los impactos directos que puede generar, ¿no?, pues genera también un malestar desde el punto de vista de la salud mental de las personas, ¿no? Entonces, que cada vez se está reportando más y de manera más específica, ¿no?, que puede crear problemas psicológicos y psiquiátricos, ¿no? ¿Te suena alguna sentencia a nivel mundial, ¿no?, de que reconozcan estos efectos, ¿no?, se haya reconocido desde el punto de vista del derecho, ¿no? Porque claro, los expertos ya van avanzando y se va obteniendo bastante información, ¿no? La pregunta es esta, si me puedes indicar alguna sentencia, algún efecto de esto. Gracias.
Thanks. That's a great question as well. These are, great questions. I'm coming back here next week again, Monica. Your audience is fantastic. So, in the court cases, generally, when people talk about violations of the right to life, or they talk about violation of cultural rights or rights of family life, they do mention the mental stress. They do mention mental health. So I think it is absolutely clear that climate change is contributing towards mental health breakdowns. And that has been specifically raised in many of the cases, so it's definitely one of the issues. I would also make the point, to go back to my fantastic book that I was promoting, the book called The Spirit Level. They make the point in that book that inequality, in this world of inequality, you also see even the rich people, super rich people, somehow are not happier. They are depressed. There are massive crises of mental health associated with this need to continually, coming to your point about continually growth, this growth-led economy. You've got to always do better, grow. And it is actually an existential crisis, because we have the idea of a growth-led economy in a planet. So we have the idea of infinite growth on a planet with finite resources. So that is a crisis which, of course, is creating a mental health problem as we try to grapple with it. So yes, I thank you for raising that. It is very important. I did see that this gentleman has had his hand up quite a bit, so I don't know whether we can take this. Oh, and there's somebody over there. But this hand I've seen for a long time. So should we take these two, that one and this one? Is that okay?
Vale, sí. Hola, perdona. Vale. Sí, que bueno, també em volia unir a la gratitud per la ponència. I sí, m'ha agradat tant veure-ho en l'exposició com quan vaig veure les notícies, la que vas posar el cas de Suïssa, de com era un cas portat des de la part civil, des de la part del poble, i veient que ha tingut efecte. I aleshores, corregeix-me si estic equivocat, de que crec que hi ha hagut casos contra les empreses petroleres, no? Que doncs, es podria debatre que són les que més pes en tota la situació, i doncs no sé si aquests casos, o podrien vindre casos futurs que signifiquessin això, no? Una situació pionera que realment signifiqués acció, ja sigui monetària o realment que rebaixessin totes les emissions o la producció d'aquests combustibles. Gràcies.
Superb question. So, human rights law binds states and not companies. You may well know that there's a move to create a UN treaty on business and human rights. We don't have such a treaty yet. So as things stand, human rights law binds state parties, not companies. However, you are starting to, of course, that is not to say that you can't litigate against a country. We all know that within every country you can litigate against a company if it violates domestic environmental law, if it pollutes rivers, if it pollutes the air, all of these sorts of things you can litigate using domestic law, but not human rights law. Until recently, that is the case. There have been some cases, and again, the Netherlands has taken a lead here. Following the agenda case, which I had talked about the Netherlands having to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. Milieu Defensie, which is Friends of the Earth in the Netherlands, took a case against Royal Dutch Shell for its carbon emissions around the world. And the Dutch court ruled against Royal Dutch Shell and said they have to reduce their carbon footprint everywhere in the world. What was Royal Dutch Shell's response? It left the Netherlands and went to the United Kingdom. So that's where it lives now. But there are cases against it also in the United Kingdom. So I think it is starting to happen. It is a fault line, but it's starting to happen. And then I think this gentleman who's had his hand up for a long time.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you very much. That was the idea of my question, but to go further, you said we have to act local. So how do we act local so as to get involved local politicians? The case you presented were against national governments. So I think the local politicians are the person who has to get involved in that war. So how do we get cases to the local courts for against local authorities and against local firms?
Yeah, I would say that. So I think the most action one can take locally is political. Try to influence the political parties, the political leaders, support green parties, these sorts of things. But if we're talking about litigation, there is a lot of litigation also at the local level. Litigating against councils for not pursuing a green agenda. You can take action against particular politicians who renege on promises. I think there is litigation you can do locally as well. I've focused more on the state level because that's also where the international human rights machinery focuses, but you can definitely litigate locally as well. And it happens all the time. In fact, there are some cases before the European Court at the moment brought by started at the local level. So they filter up. So I think on that note, I want to say thank you. I've really enjoyed this. I hope you have as well. And go well, and all power to the people, I would say.